All right, how's YouTube? So, was it 2, 3 videos ago, something like that? I read the intro out of Emmy Van Derzen's book, Everyday Mysteries. So I did ask AI about the reserve the right clause. I'm not supposed to be probably reading stuff verbatim out of here, especially chapters. But I did want to give my reaction to chapter 1, if I may. So, one loophole I think I may have found is she quotes Kierkegaard. I did actually find a pronunciation for that.
Søren Kierkegaard.
Okay. Um, I think I can read his works that she cited out of here, or quoted, because those are in public domain. Um, I did read it twice, actually, because even though I could kind of follow the train of thought to some extent, I couldn't reconstruct it even after reading it twice. I do resonate with some of this. And this is just one perspective. The philosophical underpinnings is this whole section, and his is only just one. Then chapter 2 is another philosopher, uh, Friedrich Nietzsche. So it is. I actually found this very, very astounding. To tell you the truth, I just ran across some rather negative news. It's not me personally, but I would probably take it very personally. Uh, and I have kind of briefly discussed some of the circumstances before, as little as I could, though, and not giving. I just don't want to get too much into that discussion right now, especially now. But I'm just letting you know. It is kind of ironic that I just got the news, and this chapter speaks of despair, I guess. I'm not saying, oh, look, I don't want to be that fatalistic in my views, but I don't want to ignore stuff either, like this little piece of fuzz. Um, I guess I'll try to read what I can. First of all, I'll try to react. It's almost a raw reaction. It takes me 2 chapters just reading this, it takes me twice reading the same chapter to even have a raw response, and that's just like, wow. One picture he did paint, or was it her? I think it was actually uh, Kierkegaard that painted this picture, that we're kind of suspended between two things. One is the finite, and one is the infinite. And then rather than giving completely into one or the other, we have to kind of find a center point, or we have to actually learn to navigate the tension between those 2 points. And in doing so, we're kind of like the self that's bending the bow backwards, and we're almost like an instrument or a self in that regard. So that was kind of interesting. Because on one hand, if you totally lend yourself to the infinite, I guess he's basically saying you'll be overcome with all the possibilities. You'll be swallowed up into the infinite, and it'll just be too much. He said it in more explicit terms than that, but I'm trying to remember what he said. And if you give yourself to the finite, then you're pretty much empty. So there is a verse in the Bible that reflects kind of that, but he didn't mention that verse, almost surprisingly. Something to do with why be too good or why be too evil. I think it's in Proverbs. That would have been a good verse to quote, although I'm not exactly sure if that's a reference he would have chosen. It's actually in Ecclesiastes 7, verses 16 through 17. So why ruin your life? Don't be too good or too bad, and don't be too wise or too foolish. Why should you die before your time? Try to be a little of this and a little of that. Even God's followers will do some good things and some bad things. Interesting. Okay. I think this is something I can read. It is perfectly true, as philosophers say, that life must be understood backwards, but they forget the other proposition that it must be lived forwards. Well, basically, if I was going to try to summarize this, I am going to fumble greatly, but I'm going to try anyway. It looks like he wanted to shake things up in the current philosophical or psychological culture that he was born into. And really, if he was born into this culture, he would probably do the same. Because I want to say I don't think that much has changed, but I'm not a psychologist and I'm not educated in that regard. But I do think I have some experiences. I almost said traumatic experiences, but I don't think Emmy Van Derzen fully wants people to grab onto trauma as a way to identify yourself, into this person who has been traumatized and never letting go of that identity. I could read this whole section here from his work, so I could probably read it because it is in public domain. So there I sat and smoked my cigar until I lapsed into a reverie. Among other thoughts, I remember this. You are now, I said to myself, on the way to becoming an old man, without being anything and without really undertaking to do anything. On the other hand, wherever you look about you, in literature and in life, you see the celebrated names and figures, the precious and heralded men who are coming into prominence and are much talked about, the many benefactors of the age who know how to benefit mankind by making life easier and easier, some by railways, others by omnibuses and steamboats, others by telegraph, others by easily apprehended compendiums and short recitals of everything worth knowing, and finally the true benefactors of the age who by virtue of thought make spiritual existence systematically easier and easier and yet more and more significant. And what are you doing? Here my self-communion was interrupted, for my cigar was burned out and a new one had to be lit. So I smoked again, and then suddenly there flashed through my mind this thought. You must do something, but inasmuch as with your limited capacities it will be impossible to make anything easier than it has become, you must, with the same humanitarian enthusiasm as the others, undertake to make something harder. This notion pleased me immensely, and at the same time it flattered me to think that I, like the rest of them, would be loved and esteemed by the whole community. For when all combine in every way to make everything easier and easier, there remains only one possible danger, namely, that the easiness might become so great that it would be too great. Then only one want is left, though not a felt want, that people will want difficulty. Kierkegaard, I guess from 1846. Wow. Pages 165 through 166, I think, is what she's citing. Did he have a book named after him? And she goes on to explain, kind of the context of maybe why he said that, and explain some of his theory. I guess he uses this word dielectric. Now, to me, that's an electronics term. It's kind of like when you have like electricity kind of conducting itself between an insulative barrier. And I think, if I'm right, we have two polarities in life, the infinite and the finite. I think one is basically how we stand in our position to God, the finite, or God. Not that we are God, but how we face God, the infinite. And then there's our finite nature. And I think he encourages us to stand in our finite position. We're grounded in reality, that being the finite, but we have our arms reached out to God, the infinite. That kind of makes sense in a way. I did kind of see that illustration, although I'm summarizing it greatly to the point where I'm kind of murdering it, because it's explained much better if I could only read this. But even if I read this, it would soon become pretty boring. I mean, not to me personally, but if I just read it, I'm going to try to honor the copyright of this book, but I don't think she has a copyright on what he says. So he does look at the underpinnings of Christianity for some guidelines on how he formed his existentialism. He looked at the story of Adam and Eve. I don't know, I didn't quite get this, but his idea of the spirit almost sounds like when you form, what's that word that I keep thinking of? It's kind of like your own free will, but I can't think of it right now. I don't know if that's something I've ever heard of, but he actually considers anxiety like a starting position for growth, if I understood that right. Instead of going to your therapist to diminish or try to reduce your anxiety, for him it's a catalyst, I think, for growth. That's not exactly how he put it. So I don't want to be held to account for how I may be misrepresenting this. I'm just trying to summarize, since they won't let me quote things. And since I'm not going to probably grab a note card and make this into a college essay, I'm just this is kind of like my reaction, which is wow. Now, some of this language here from 1844, I suppose it is actually casual for its day, but it's kind of dizzying, literally. He uses the word dizzy here quite a bit. In 1844, I guess he said this: anxiety may be compared to dizziness. He whose eye happens to look down into the yawning abyss becomes dizzy. But what is the reason for this? It is just as much in his own eye as in the abyss, for suppose he had not looked down. Hence anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, which emerges when the spirit wants to posit the synthesis and freedom looks down. Let me start over. Hence, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, which emerges when the spirit wants to posit the synthesis and freedom looks down into its own possibility, laying hold of finiteness to support itself. Freedom succumbs in this dizziness. Probably not the best statement for today's world, because it sounds like you'd have to really interpret that graciously a little bit. But he did say some amazing things. Here's another thing he said. Again, 1844. This is what he said about anxiety being the best guide. We always consider anxiety and fear to be of the devil, right? But this is an adventure, us Christians, that is. This is an adventure that every human being must go through, to learn to be anxious in order that he may not perish either by never having been in anxiety or by succumbing in anxiety. Whoever has learned to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate. Kierkegaard. Am I saying his name wrong already? Probably so. So basically, he's speaking of anxiety as the experience, our own personal experience of, and how we confront it. How we're actually confronting our own paradox between the two things, finite and infinite. And there's other words besides that he was using to describe like secular life versus your spiritual life. I didn't really say that, but I'm trying to summarize. He described both the secular life and the religion in kind of, or maybe this is what Emmy did, but he'd probably agree. Maybe she's the one here describing the secular life as paraphernalia and religion as a cloak, not hiding ourselves in God or in the trappings of our social standing or status. I'm trying not to infringe upon copyright problems. But I think we can hide ourselves under the shadow of wings for sure. But if it's like avoiding responsibility, I suppose that's a whole nother way of hiding. Here's another quote of his. I think I can read this again because this is public domain. The man of immediacy does not know himself. He quite literally identifies himself only by the clothes he wears. He identifies having a self by externalities. There is hardly a more ludicrous mistake, for a self is indeed infinitely distinct from an externality. I swear that's not hard to say, but I'm behind this camera now, it is. So when the externals have completely changed for the person and he has despaired, he goes one step further. He thinks something like this. It becomes as a wish. What if I became someone else, got myself a new self? Well, what if he did become someone else? I wonder if he would recognize himself. So she's bringing that up to point out his skepticism and that there actually is a true self and you can't really change it. Although you can dress it up differently, things like that. No, I do actually believe you can change. But I suppose there is a very core inner self that is the true self. And you could philosophically argue that maybe that is what it is. I don't know, leaving that open, but here's another quote from him. The conscious synthesis of infinitude and finitude that relates itself to itself, whose task is to become itself, which can be done only through the relationship to God. To become oneself is to become concrete. But to become concrete is neither to become finite nor to become infinite, for that which is to become concrete is indeed a synthesis. Consequently, the progress of the becoming must be an infinite moving away from itself in the infinitizing of the self, and an infinite coming back to itself in the finitizing process. That's honestly too much for me. I think what he's saying is that and he did actually say this somewhere else, or maybe she summarized it more adequately. I'm not sure. Like, you know what alternating current is, that you're actually going back and forth between two states in rapid succession, and you kind of have some quality of alternating current, whatever. I'm probably not saying that right, or alternate, or voltage. Only that person's life was wasted who went on to living so deceived by life's joys or its sorrows that he never became decisively and eternally conscious as spirit, as self, or what amounts to the same thing, never became aware, and in the deepest sense, never gained the impression that there is a God, and that he himself, his self, exists before this God, an infinite benefaction that is never gained except through despair. But despair also is not my savior. So I want to make that point known. So I don't want this to be an invitation for despair, but I guess there's some truth to the fact that it's not wasted if you have found yourself in that position. And I think I'm getting more news right now. about something, which is quite despairing, actually. Okay. What is called the secular mentality consists simply of such men who, so to speak, mortgage themselves to the world. They use their capacities, amass money, carry on secular enterprises, calculate shrewdly, etc., perhaps make a name in history, but themselves they are not. Spiritually speaking, they have no self for those whose sake they could venture everything, no self before God, however self-seeking they are otherwise. So I guess he's undermining social and personal success is not an indicator of your well-being necessarily. What the self now lacks is indeed actuality, and in ordinary language too, we say that an individual has become unreal. And when he's using this word unreal, he's referring to if you totally immersed yourself in the infinite. It's not, he considers it unreal. However, closer scrutiny reveals that what he actually lacks is necessity. And necessity comes from what is we experience in our finite state, because we have needs here that we come to terms with. Actuality is the unity of possibility and necessity. So the possibility is with the infinite, because there's all kinds of possibilities there. And then necessity comes from the finite. Is how I understand it. And apparently he continues on with an explanation of how the balance between possibility and necessity can be maintained. So the infinitude would be like your head is in the clouds. Oh, life's dialectic. But that's about the extent, I think, of what I can mention. Oh, there's more. There's actually more, if you're interested. Now, I did kind of kick introspection under the bus a few videos back. Even though I am highly introspective, I do realize there's a point where you just have to take some action. So this kind of reflects how my mind does think in advance to something I'm going to read in the future. Do you ever find yourself there? But this is a lot more intricate way to say it. And it's not how I would say it, but this is how he said it. Well, this is somebody else. So I don't know if I can read this. Gardner, 1988. I probably better not read that. But it did mention introspection was kind of just like mental agreement, but with no action, I think is what it was saying. No self-commitment, you're just merely acknowledging stuff that's going on the inside. But it's no replacement for action. That's the best way I could summarize this real quickly. I only want to read stuff this guy says because I know it's probably public domain. And I'm not sure if I want to read that one. That one's a good one too, I just read here, but I guess I'll read it. That if real success is to attend the effort to bring a man to a definite position, one must first of all take pains to find him where he is and begin there. This is the secret of the art of helping others. Anyone who has not mastered this is himself deluded when he proposes to help others. In order to help another effectively, I must understand more than he. Yet first of all, surely I must understand what he understands. Kierkegaard. And I think there's like two more things I can read. And the last one's actually pretty good. Like better than all the rest. Saving the best for last. And this speaks of self-humiliation. To help does not mean to be a sovereign, but to be a servant. That to help does not mean to be ambitious, but to be patient. That to help means to endure for the time being the imputation that one is in the wrong and does not understand what the other understands. And here's like the one that kind of speaks volumes here. I do not have the right to become insensitive to life's pain because I shall sorrow. But neither do I have the right to despair because I shall sorrow. And neither do I have the right to stop sorrowing because I shall sorrow. So it is with love. You do not have the right to become insensitive to this feeling because you shall love. And just as little do you have the right to warp this feeling in you because you shall love. You shall preserve love, and you shall preserve yourself, and in preserving yourself, preserve love. And you shall preserve yourself, and in preserving yourself, preserve love. Kierkegaard, 1847. B. I don't know why it says B. The second part of that year. It appears like he lived from 1813 to 1855. Is that right? If that's what that range refers to, looks like I've already outlived him. Dang. Anyway, that was just one perspective. Remember in my last little introduction of this book, she mentioned that she's going to bring about different philosophical underpinnings. And in fact, these underpinnings may have some either contradictions or seemingly have contradictions. And she just said flat out they would have contradictions. It's like, prepare yourself. She didn't say that, but to her it's irony, and she did speak of irony within this first chapter too. And it's how to navigate the irony. And maybe I missed a quote of his that touched on that. But there's mastering irony. I'm trying to read something here and see if I can summarize it. So there's two main things to look out for in ideology. And one is fanaticism, or like a blind belief, and the other is like nihilism, or just totally blind denial. So maybe we could have a little faith. I'm not saying mix it with doubt, but I think without faith it's impossible to please God. So you do have to have such faith. Sometimes there's foolish faith, but sometimes that foolish faith is exactly what God honors too, because foolish is kind of like in the eyes of the beholder. What could be foolish to man could be wise with God. But there are actions men take, maybe in the name of faith or in the name of God, that indeed are foolish. So I can't tell you how to think on this matter. I'm just trying to navigate that first chapter, and that was quite something to navigate, because I had to read it twice to even fumble my way through this video. And I wasn't going to read anything that she said, so I don't want to get myself in trouble. I may have already kind of did some things that could be frowned upon just by reading the introduction, but I read it so poorly that maybe that'll be my safeguard. I couldn't read it very well. So there's actually a role in anxiety, according to this. There's the infinite and the finite. Anyhow, despair has a place. Autonomy is the word. It almost looks to me like when you reach that point of autonomy where you become like you're expressing your own free will and standing your own ground, so to speak. That's when you adapt your own spirit. And I mean, he kind of almost makes it sound like the spirit as in like the actual metaphysical. I don't know. Anyway, it was an interesting read. I mean, he himself, or at least her, seems to recommend taking a lot of things, a lot of dynamics with a grain of salt. But yet we are interested enough in reading this and trying to contemplate. So I guess our understanding of these things could change, could develop, could evolve. So just be prepared for that. I'm going to leave it. This was a very dry video. I won't lie, but I do trust you found some interest. I said I was going to go on a little bit more. I don't know how much I'm going to read this book. I paid for it. I don't know how I'm going to necessarily do a video every time I read a chapter unless something really strikes me. The first one did kind of strike me as very interesting to me, but I don't know if I could. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see where this takes me. It's very interesting reading. A little dry in some ways, but it's got some points of view that are probably much needed. Probably much needed in today's world. Between the mundane and the spiritual, between the infinite and the finite. So we stand grounded upon the earth, I guess you could say, in our finite humanness, but we are reaching out to God, the infinite. But we do remain grounded, I guess, according to him. Hey man, I want to become ungrounded. Take me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, right? I'm not speaking of death per se, because death also is not our savior. Sometimes I think the rapture could be, but I know I've heard some teaching also that we need to change our eschatology. Who was that said that? I can't think of her name right now. But some teaching about the end times. I mean, I always think, if we're looking at current events and always asking, how does this fit in the prophetic picture? I think we're kind of missing the picture, because that's like one lens. It's not necessarily always like the biblical way to look at things, I don't think. Because how many times have we missed it? Now, I know that's dangerously close to things have always been the way they've always been. When is the promise of his coming and all that? But we also stand this danger of always trying to look through the prophetic lens. How does this relate prophetically? How does this relate prophetically? And sometimes I think we just have to let God be God. Be aware of our surroundings, interpret the times, because yes, it does also say about not being able to discern the times, and that's probably from people you stop looking. But I noticed in our looking, in today's Christianity, it's kind of hit or miss a lot. And sometimes I just get the feeling like it's a lot of misses, but maybe I'm just being extra critical. But that's me. I mean, I know there's going to be a time when things end up being the way they've been forecasted. prophets will be right. God lets them be right. If he lets them be, huh? I don't know if that's the right way to look at it. But I've probably said enough, and now I'm beginning to get a little off topic into other things. That being said, I think we'll end the video and be blessed. And sorry for the dryness of the topic and my voice, really. All right, thank you. Oh yeah, feel free to leave a comment if you feel so inclined. In this case, I'd hope you'd actually be interested in and don't jab me for a boring video. I already know that. So hope you still found it interesting, because underneath the exterior of this absolute boredom, remember, it's just kind of like a wrapping over a gift. And I'm sorry it was like a brown paper bag instead of this glorious Christmas wrapping that it could have been if I was a little more polished in my presentation and knew how to present this better. But I guess I haven't let it stop me, have I? So, all right.